On a royal throne sat the decomposing body of a young woman. A diadem adorned her balding head, and her corpse was wrapped in the splendid robes of a queen. Around the throne stood the courtiers, each waiting for his turn to kneel and kiss the hem of her gown, paying her in death the respect that no one had shown her while she was alive. It may sound like a scene from a horror film, but it is the true story of King Pedro I and his beloved Inês de Castro. Murdered on the orders of her lover's father, she would become the first corpse in history to be proclaimed queen. In today's video, I will tell you their beautiful but terrifying love story, forever shrouded in the icy cold of the grave. Leave a like and let's begin. We have now travelled back to 14th century Portugal, where today's story will unfold. At that time, the country had gained its independence only a few generations earlier, and was still under considerable pressure from its powerful neighbours, Castile, Aragon and Leon. Portugal was ruled by King Afonso IV, who saw it as his life's purpose to preserve his country's autonomy at any cost. And what could be more useful for creating alliances and conducting diplomacy in the Middle Ages than marriage? For each of his children, the king chose a politically valuable match, and naturally love played no part in these arrangements. For his son Pedro, he chose Constanza Manuel, the daughter of the nobleman Don Juan Manuel, a chronicler and poet who owned several towns and castles, and was also a descendant of the kings of Castile, Leon and Aragon. In other words, she was exactly the kind of bride who could help secure an alliance with those neighbouring territories. Their wedding took place in 1340, but although Constanza was a beautiful young woman who undoubtedly deserved her husband's love, Pedro regarded their marriage solely as a political arrangement and remained indifferent to his wife. However, Constanza did not arrive from Spain alone. Among those who accompanied her was her 14-year-old lady-in-waiting, Inês de Castro, an illegitimate member of an influential family, and the granddaughter of King Sancho IV. Pedro fell in love with her at first sight. By the way, just a few days ago, I released a video on my channel about other famous royal bastards, so in case you missed it, be sure to watch it. Inês was considered the most enchanting flower of her homeland, and her contemporaries said that her innocence rivaled her beauty. Despite being born illegitimate, her position was high enough to allow her to move freely within the highest circles of the aristocracy. However, it would never have allowed her to wear a crown or become the official bride of someone like Pedro, and this would later play an important role in her story. Naturally, Constanza was far from pleased by the passionate romance unfolding between her husband and her lady-in-waiting right before her eyes, and she tried to use cunning to separate Inês from Pedro. When her son Luis was born, Constanza invited Inês to become the child's godmother. At that time, Catholics regarded the spiritual bond between a godparent and the child's family as almost equal to a blood relationship, which meant that if Inês continued her affair with Pedro, their relationship could be considered a form of incest. However, the little boy, Constanza's first son, died soon after his birth. Once again, Constanza blamed Inês, seeing the child's death as yet another consequence of the curse she believed her rival had brought upon her family. In an attempt to put an end to the lovers' relationship, King Afonso sent Inês into exile in the border regions of Portugal, far away from the royal court. But distance could not break their bond. The lovers continued to exchange letters and meet in secret, and before long, their first son was born. But unfortunately, the boy did not live for long. Later, however, Inês gave birth to a daughter and 2 more sons. What had begun as nothing more than a prince's passionate affair, the kind of affair people at court would normally overlook, gradually began to seem like a serious threat to everyone around them. First of all, King Afonso feared that Pedro might one day place one of his illegitimate children on the throne, instead of Ferdinand, his lawful son by Constanza. Secondly, Inés's brothers, the Castilian aristocrats Álvaro Pérez de Castro and Fernando de Castro, began receiving more and more positions and privileges from Pedro, while also becoming increasingly involved in his political decisions. The brothers had their own powerful claims to authority, and they eventually succeeded in having Pedro declared a claimant to the thrones of Castile and Leon. This greatly displeased Afonso IV, who was determined to keep Portugal neutral and independent. In 1449, Constanza died after giving birth, and her death finally cleared the way for the lovers. Pedro became determined to bind his life to Ines at any cost, even though his father continued to offer him one foreign bride after another. When and where their secret wedding took place remains a mystery. However, Pedro himself later claimed on several occasions that the marriage had indeed happened, and his words were supported by numerous servants who said they had witnessed it. Meanwhile, the nobles began to place increasing pressure on King Afonso IV, demanding that he resolve the matter of Ines once and for all. They complained that this proud woman knows how to blind Dom Pedro completely and manipulate him, and threatened, "We, the old Portuguese nobility, will unite to destroy this arrogant woman and her tyrannical family." On January 6, 1355, the king summoned a secret council, which accused Ines of high treason without any trial or investigation and sentenced her to death. 3 noblemen, Álvaro Gonçalves, Pedro Coelho, and Diogo Lopes Pacheco, then set out with the king for the cloister in Coimbra, intending to carry out their sinister mission the following day. Legend has it that something strange happened on the morning of January 7th. Pedro was preparing to go hunting, and as he and his men were getting ready to leave, an old black dog suddenly broke away from the pack. Without any apparent reason, the fierce animal rushed towards Ines, ready to attack her. Pedro immediately stepped between them to protect his beloved and killed the dog with a single blow. It collapsed at Ines's feet, splattering her dress with blood. Some of those who witnessed the scene saw it as an omen of death, but Pedro ignored this warning from fate and left for the hunt. Ines was left alone, and an overwhelming fear took hold of her. She felt that something terrible was going to happen that day. Soon afterwards, King Afonso IV and his advisors entered the monastery of Santa Clara a Vela. There are several different accounts of what happened next. Some sources claim that everything took place in front of Ines's children, and that the king himself was present. At first, he supposedly began to reconsider his decision after seeing how terrified his grandchildren were, and watching Ines fall to her knees before him, begging for mercy. However, after the executioners continued to pressure him, the king finally said, "Do whatever you want," and left the room. Ines was then beheaded before the eyes of her own children. According to another version, Ines was in the garden when she was murdered, and drops of her blood fell into a nearby fountain. To this day, tourists visiting the site believe that the red stones at the bottom of the fountain resemble Inês' blood, while the strands of algae floating in the water look like her hair. Whatever truly happened that day, it is deeply tragic that this young woman, only 29 years old, became the victim of political intrigue and a bitter struggle between a father, his son, and the aristocracy. When Pedro returned from the hunt, he found his beloved murdered and immediately understood whose hands were behind her death. Enraged, the prince launched a war against his father, a war that neither side was able to win. The conflict finally ended in August 1355 with a compromise under which father and son swore to forget everything that had happened. However, Pedro deliberately left himself a way out. The third article of the agreement stated, "I promise, Your Majesty, that, for as long as Your Majesty lives, I will not pursue those responsible for the murder of my late wife, Dona Inês de Castro." After Afonso died at the end of May 1357, it became clear that the new king had taken this cause very seriously. One of Pedro's first acts as king was to punish the men who had murdered Inês. One of the 3, Diogo Lopes Pacheco, managed to escape to England in time, but Pedro ordered the other 2 to be tortured to death with particular cruelty. Before the torture began, they were forced to choose whether their hearts would be torn from their bodies through their backs or through their chests while they were still alive. horrified by such brutality. The nobility gave the monarchs the name by which he would become known in history, Pedro the Cruel. Pedro also began fighting for the rights of his children by Ines and demanded that they be recognized as legitimate. This was exactly the decision the nobles had feared so greatly, and in the future it would indeed contribute to a dynastic crisis and confusion after Pedro's death. However, despite all his efforts to secure the future of his children with Ines when he died in 1367, Ferdinand I, his son by Constanza, was proclaimed king. Pedro's children by Ines later married members of other aristocratic families and would still play their own important roles in the history of Portugal. But even this was not enough for Pedro. He wanted everyone who had turned his father against Ines during her lifetime and considered her unworthy of the crown to admit that they had been wrong and repent. On April 2nd, 1361, when Ines had already been dead for several years and her body had been decomposing in its grave, Pedro ordered her remains to be removed from her tomb at the monastery of Santa Clara and brought to Coimbra Cathedral. There, a ceremony had been prepared for her, unlike anything the world had ever seen. 2 thrones were erected, writes Paul Gerhard Seidler in his biography of Ines. The king sat upon one of them, while the remains of Ines were placed upon the other. The dead woman was dressed in a purple mantle and adorned with countless jewels, while a crown rested upon her balding head. The Archbishop of Braga anointed her body with holy oil and kissed the edge of her mantle, as well as her stiffened hand. Everyone else who had gathered there was then required to do the same. You have to agree that a ceremony like this would make anyone's hair stand on end and send the chilling cold of the grave through their body. However, most historians argue that this was only a legend which became widely known because of Geronimo Bermudez's play written in 1577, and that nothing of the kind ever truly happened. Pedro did, however, have Ines's remains moved because he wanted to be reunited with his beloved after death. He devised a special arrangement for their burial, placing their sarcophagi directly opposite one another, so that when they rose again before the Last Judgment, their first glance would be a glance of love. Their entire love story was carved into the marble of their tombs, together with the words "Ate o fim do mundo," until the end of the world. The story of Ines and Pedro is often described as a real-life version of Romeo and Juliet. And yes, it also has death, forbidden love, and a conflict between 2 families. Yet, for some reason, the story of Ines has always seemed even more dramatic to me. This was no youthful romance between 2 teenagers, but a vast political game. Children who witnessed the murder of their own mother, and one person's obsession with another that continued long after death had separated them. Had you heard the story of the Corpse Queen before? And what do you think about the love between Ines and Pedro? Share your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.